The year was 1966. America's at war with Vietnam. For the first time ever, U.S. soldiers are faced with full-scale jungle warfare. As military missions take forces deep into the heart of the Indo-Chinese forest, extraordinary stories begin to filter back from the field. Stories about encounters with strange creatures.
Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree. I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
Deep in Bigfoot territory. Episode 38, The Vietnam Rock Apes. This is a Squatch Mafia documentary. Welcome to today's episode of Bigfoot territory. In this episode, we are going to revisit the Vietnam Rock Apes, and again take a look at the fascinating stories of encounters with cryptids from the Vietnam War. We will investigate the native myths, as well as reports coming from Western explorers and soldiers in the region. Also check the links in the video description for another Bigfoot territory episode on cryptids from Asia and other videos on the Vietnam rock apes. So, let's start today's episode. The landscapes and jungles of Asia are home to countless myths and legends of hominid cryptids and wildmen. The legendary rock apes of Vietnam, the Yeren of China, the Orang Pendek of Sumatra, or the Abu Gogo from the island of Flores are just a few to name. Let us take a look at the Vietnam rock apes today. The larger Western public first heard of the Vietnam rock apes during the Indochina Wars from 1945 to 1975, namely through French and American soldiers who had strange and violent, sometimes deadly encounters with large hominids in the depths of the dense Vietnamese jungle. But the first European reports of large bipedal apes from the region are much older than that. The European involvement in Vietnam goes back as far as the 1760s, when French Jesuit and Catholic priests arrived in the area. At that point, Vietnam had only begun its push to the south and the occupation of the Mekong Delta, a remote region that formerly had been part of the ancient Khmer Empire until the early 15th century. The Central Highlands of Vietnam, a jungle-covered mountain region between Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, had never been populated before and were barely discovered. The few tribes of the remote region were described as violent and savage and kept outsiders away for centuries. From the 1780s on, the French colonial empire began to establish French Indochina in Vietnam. With that, the first expedition started to explore the rivers and jungles of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, places that had not been touched by Europeans before. Among the first Western explorers to enter the Central Highlands were French Jesuit priests. In 1820, French ship Captain El Rey reported a story told to him by one of this Jesuit missionaries, who claimed that he saw hair-covered, upright walking ape men in the dense jungles of the Central Highlands. He said the tribe he was with called this creatures Moi, what he translated as wild man or wild people. The tribe, that inhabited a remote village in the Central Highlands, lived in deep fear of these ape men, the Jesuit reported. The priest said he had encountered these creatures personally in the deep jungle and described them as 6.5 to 7 feet tall and covered with a reddish-brown fur, similar to that of an orang-utan. The next documented report comes from 1830, as French Jesuit priest Father François Gagelin reported similar tales of large ape men from the highland tribes of Cambodia. He dismissed them as superstition, but noted that it was remarkable how much the isolated tribes in the highland jungle feared the creatures and avoided the places they believed to be the territories of the Batutut, as they called these beings. The highland tribes told stories in which the ape men attacked remote villages, mostly to steal food, farm animals, and sometimes even human babies. The creatures were also responsible for many dead or disappeared wanderers and travelers, the tribesmen claimed. In 1895, famous French anthropologist Paul d'Enjoy undertook various expeditions in French Indochina. From one of these expeditions, as he traveled from Vietnam to Cambodia through the Central Highlands, he reported an encounter with a large and hair-covered hominid in the mountains of the Central Highlands. He said his local guides refused to follow the wild man, and he was not able to capture the creature. From 1905 to 1911, various French expeditions tried to secure the peace between the French administration in Indochina and the Highland tribes in Cambodia. The expeditions were led by explorer and author Henri Maitre, who was an important figure in establishing the influence of French Indochina in rural Cambodia. Maitre was one of the first to collect the oral traditions of the Proto-Indochinese tribes in the remote region, and published his results in his 1912 best-selling book, Les Jungles Mois. In this book he reported various stories and tales from the mountainous forest regions of the Central Highlands, in which the ape men, mostly named Moi or Batutut, were mentioned. The description of these creatures as tall, hair-covered wild men or upright walking apes were always similar. In 1914, Maitre was murdered at age 31 by tribesmen in a jungle village in the Central Highlands, so his ethnographic research into the local traditions ended abruptly. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, more tales and encounters were briefly mentioned by French explorers and military officials from the mountain plateaus and forests of the Central Highlands. The next documented story comes from 1947, as French officer Jules Aroy told various French military magazines about his encounter with ape men in French Indochina. He described the creature as an animal that was neither human nor monkey and looked like a very tall, fully hair-covered man. Aroy stated that his native sergeant told him the creatures were well known to the locals, who avoided and feared them. After the United States started the Vietnam War, similar stories began to spread almost immediately among the troops, as the first American soldiers entered the Central Highlands in the 1960s. It was the first time in history that large numbers of humans had entered this remote areas of nearly unpopulated forests and highland mountains. For the troops on the ground, the war soon turned into a nightmarish trip of jungle combat against an elusive and merciless enemy who was invisible and always present. There are many different types of rock ape stories from the war. In some, the soldiers saw them during battle, crossing or escaping the battlefield. In others, patrols shot at them because the ape men were mistaken to be Viet Cong soldiers. There are stories in which the North Vietnamese soldiers fled the battlefield in panic, leaving even their weapons behind after encountering an ape man during combat. In one story, an American platoon heard screams and roars during a night patrol, and were told by the local guides that these are the screams of the foul monkey, or stench monkey, a dangerous predator. On the next morning, the platoon found the bodies of multiple dead Viet Cong soldiers in the direction from which they heard the screams the night before. The bodies were so brutally dismembered and beaten to death that some of the US soldiers were traumatized by the events and asked to be transferred from their platoon in the jungle. Many of the US soldiers refused to speak in public on their encounters with these cryptid hominids in the forests and jungles of the Central Highlands. Let's listen to Sergeant Thomas Jacobs and his encounter story from the Vietnam War for a short moment. See the links in the video description to watch the complete documentary featuring the entire interview.
As a young soldier in Vietnam in 1969, veteran Tom Jacobs was often sent on reconnaissance missions into the thick jungle. One day, though, he witnessed something he will never forget.
We really didn't know what it was. It sounded like the North Vietnamese were attacking us with tanks.
A band of large primates began throwing rocks at his platoon.
I had heard that there had been previous problems with what we called rock apes, and in fact, at one point, a band of them threw one Marine off the rock pile. And so we were wary of them, without a doubt.
What Sergeant Jacobs had seen may have been any one of a number of primate species which inhabit the Indochinese forest. But several times, he says, they came face to face with a creature that was entirely different.
This animal was stockier. He was of darker color, a lot more muscular. This different creature would, early in the morning, burst out of the jungle into a clearing and just rail at us, just yell and scream and shake his fists. And it was very human behavior, and it was real obvious that he took exception to our presence there.
There are literally hundreds of stories on encounters of the Vietnam rock apes during the American presence in Vietnam. Far too many to mention all of them here. But there is one place that seems to be linked to the Vietnam rock apes more often than any other location mentioned in the stories from the war. Dong Den Mountain is a jungle-covered elevation 2,900 feet above sea level, 5 miles outside of Da Nang. In 1966, the Marines built an airfield and a radar station on top of the mountain. Among the soldiers, the base soon became known as Monkey Mountain. The maybe most famous rock ape story comes from a place on Dong Den Mountain with the military code name Hill 868. In Bigfoot literature, the story is often referred to as the Battle of Monkey Mountain or the Battle of Dong Den. In this story, a platoon was attacked by a group of at least 10 ape men and opened fire on the creatures. During the attack, multiple Marines were killed or severely wounded. Some of the ape men were also shot and killed. After some months, the Marines on Monkey Mountain took the existence of a hominid biped in the jungle around them as a given fact. The U.S. military officially never reported on any strange sightings from the forests of Da Nang. But there is another famous story in Bigfoot lore that originally emerged on Monkey Mountain. Another U.S. soldier who was stationed at the Da Nang Air Force Base was a man named Frank Hansen, who became a promoter and exhibitor after he returned from Vietnam to the United States. His most famous exhibit, which Hansen displayed at shopping malls, carnivals, and state fairs in the US and Canada in the late 1960s and early 70s, became known as the Minnesota Iceman and is a legend for itself. The Minnesota Iceman was a man-like creature frozen in a block of ice that has been described as male, human-like, around 6 feet tall, with large hands and feet, covered in dark brown hair and with a flattened nose. One of its arms appeared to be broken, and one of its eyes appeared to have been knocked out of its socket, allegedly by a bullet that was said to have entered the creature's head from behind. Hansen promoted the Iceman as the missing link between man and Neanderthal, and, over the years, came up with various, contradicting stories about its origin. Let's listen to researchers Lloyd and Dr. Lufs Wissawa on the Minnesota Iceman and its origin. See the links in the video description for the complete documentary.
Anthropologist Dr. Helmut Lufs Wissawa of the Australian National University believes that the creature may in fact have originated in Vietnam.
Within the so-called demilitarized zone came a very strange report which was published on the 1st of November 1966. These US Marines in that area had shot and killed a big ape.
Large apes shouldn't exist in Vietnam. And interestingly, there was a connection between showman Hansen and this area.
Frank Hansen is an ex-fighter pilot of the United States Air Force, of a unit which was stationed in Da Nang. Frank Hansen starts to exhibit a creature which responds very well to that description of being a huge ape, just a few weeks practically after this first mention of this creature.
I think the Minnesota Iceman was indeed a freshly killed corpse.
Hominid researcher Lloyd witnessed the Iceman for himself. It triggered a lifelong passion.
The body was in a 7-foot freezer, long and about 3 feet wide and about 3.5 feet deep. It was put in with its knees lifted up a little bit and it had its arm up over its head. It sees him, it puts its arm up like this to protect its face. He shoots through the wrist, the bullet plows right between those two bones, goes into the eye, and blows out the back of the head. And my seeing it leads me to believe that it was a juvenile Bigfoot. The Iceman shows us by its reality that what we think about ourselves and about the fauna on Earth is just not the way it is.
Two of the most influential cryptozoologists ever, Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans and Ivan T. Sanderson, examined the Minnesota Iceman in Frank Hansen's private house for days. Both later stated and wrote that the exhibit in the ice block was a real body of a large unknown primate. Legend has it that the FBI began to invest Hansen and the Minnesota Iceman in the early 70s, and the original exhibit disappeared shortly after that. Some say Hansen burned the original Minnesota Iceman himself in fear of the FBI investigation. Others say the government agency took it from him. From the mid-70s on, Hansen showed an obvious fake instead of the original Minnesota Iceman exhibit. The rumors that the Iceman was indeed one of the ape men from Dong Den Mountain, smuggled out of Vietnam by Hansen and some Air Force comrades, were never debunked. The Iceman became a legend in the cryptid underground and is one of the many classic stories linked to the Vietnam rock apes. But the stories of tall, hair-covered bipeds in the jungles of Vietnam did not only emerge on the American side of the war. The North Vietnamese soldiers described the same beings and encounters from the Central Highlands. That even led the North Vietnamese military to launch several expeditions into the highland jungles to search for the elusive creatures. It is reported that these expeditions indeed had sightings and encounters with the ape men of Vietnam and found various tracks and habituation sites. So, the stories of large, upright walking hominids living in the dense highland jungles of Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia are confirmed by many sources and reach back centuries. From the ancient native tales of the Batutut, to the stories of Western colonizers and Jesuit priests, to those of French and American soldiers in the Indochina Wars and the Vietnam War, the description of these beings has remained consistent. The beings were always described as around 6 feet tall, hair-covered, and aggressive and territorial. The indigenous population avoids the regions in the Highland Mountains they believe to be the territory of these creatures, from ancient times until today. You can also find various other videos on the Vietnam rock apes and on cryptids in Asia on the Squatch Mafia YouTube channel. See the links in the video description below. What is your opinion on the Vietnam rock apes and the stories coming from the war? Have you experienced something strange or heard strange stories from the region yourself? Let me know in the comments. Hit the like button if you have enjoyed this episode of Bigfoot Territory. Subscribe to the Squatch Mafia channel at YouTube for more videos on Bigfoot and Sasquatch. Check out Squatch Mafia at Patreon and TikTok for extra content. Thank you for watching.